Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Spring of 2018 was supposed to be my fresh start after everything fell apart with my ex-husband. I'd been house hunting for months with what little I got from the settlement, scrolling through listings during lunch breaks at the accounting firm where I worked downtown. When I saw the foreclosed Victorian on Willow Court, priced at nearly half the market value for the neighborhood, I jumped on it immediately. My realtor, this overly enthusiastic guy named Brandon, who kept talking about his CrossFit achievements, seemed almost relieved when I said I wanted to make an offer without even asking too many questions. He mentioned something vague about the previous owners abandoning the property, but honestly, I was too focused on the original hardwood floors and the vintage clawfoot tub to care about the details. My sister called me reckless for buying a house sight unseen except for photos, but after sleeping on her couch for 3 months while the divorce finalized, I would have moved into a cardboard box if it meant having my own space again. Moving day came on a Tuesday in early April, and I remember thinking how perfect everything looked with the cherry blossoms blooming in the front yard. I'd hired these 2 college kids from Craigslist to help with the heavy stuff, and we spent the morning hauling boxes and furniture through the narrow hallways. Around noon, while I was unpacking dishes in the kitchen, I noticed this older woman standing on the sidewalk just staring at my house with her phone raised like she was taking pictures. She had this oversized sun hat and a floral dress that looked straight out of a gardening magazine, but something about the way she lingered there made me uncomfortable. When I stepped out onto the porch to ask if she needed something, she practically ran to her car, a silver sedan with one of those true crime podcast stickers on the bumper. I brushed it off as neighborhood curiosity. You know how people get when someone new moves in, especially in these tight-knit suburban areas where everyone knows everyone else's business. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed normal enough, just the usual settling-in period with its share of minor annoyances. I figured out which floorboards creaked, learned that the upstairs bathroom faucet needed an extra twist to stop dripping, and discovered that the previous owners had painted over some truly hideous wallpaper in the dining room. But then the visitors started coming more frequently. Every morning when I left for work, there would be fresh flowers on my porch steps, usually cheap carnations from the grocery store, still in their plastic wrapping. At first I thought maybe Brandon, the realtor, was trying to be welcoming or something, but when I texted him about it, he seemed genuinely confused. Then came the weekend crowds, groups of 3 or 4 people who would park across the street and just stand there, pointing at different windows, taking pictures, sometimes even posing for selfies in front of my driveway. One guy, probably in his early 20s with a patchy beard and a backwards baseball cap, actually had the nerve to walk up my front path and peer through my living room window while I was watching TV on a Saturday afternoon. I finally lost it when I came home from work on a Friday to find at least a dozen people milling around on the sidewalk, some holding candles, others leaving teddy bears and handwritten notes against my fence. I marched out there, still in my office clothes and probably looking like I was about to murder someone myself, demanding to know what the hell was going on. Most of them scattered immediately, but this one woman, maybe mid-40s with box-dyed red hair and thick glasses, actually had the audacity to ask me how it felt to live in the murder house. My whole body went numb when she said that, like someone had dumped ice water straight into my veins. She pulled out her phone and showed me this true crime blog called Cold Cases and Hot Takes, with my house as the header image, except in the photo, there was yellow police tape across the porch and cop cars in the driveway. The headline read, "5th Anniversary of the Hartley Family Massacre. Will we ever find Lily?" That night I barely slept, just sat at my laptop reading everything I could find about what happened in my house. 5 years ago, almost to the day I'd signed the papers, Robert Hartley had killed his wife Jennifer and their 2 kids, 9-year-old twins named Lily and Lucas. The news articles were graphic in that sensationalized way local media gets when something this horrible happens in a quiet neighborhood. He'd used a hammer from his own garage, Started in the master bedroom where Jennifer was sleeping, then moved to Lucas's room down the hall. But Lily was never found. Just blood on her sheets and her window left wide open. The police figured Robert had hidden her body somewhere before he hanged himself in the basement, but they never located her remains despite searching the property multiple times, even bringing in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. The case went cold after 6 months, and the bank foreclosed on the house when no next of kin came forward to claim it. Apparently, it had been sitting empty ever since, through 3 different real estate agencies who couldn't move it until Brandon and his company picked it up and decided not to disclose the full history. I spent that entire weekend in a weird daze, walking through my house and seeing it differently now, imagining where everything had happened. The master bedroom, my bedroom now, where I'd been sleeping for weeks in the same spot where Jennifer Hartley had died. Lucas's room, which I'd been using as a home office, setting up my desk probably right where his bed had been. And Lily's room, the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall that I'd been using for storage. Just boxes piled everywhere because I hadn't gotten around to organizing yet. Saturday morning, I decided to start renovating immediately. Not because I'm particularly brave or anything, but because I literally couldn't afford to move again. And maybe if I changed everything about the house, I could forget what had happened here. I started with the basement, figuring I'd turn it into a proper laundry room instead of the creepy, unfinished concrete cave it currently was. The water heater down there had been making these weird gurgling sounds anyway, so I called a plumber to come look at it Monday morning. The plumber, this burly guy named Frank who smelled like cigarettes and had grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, showed up around 10 while I was working from home. He went straight to the basement while I stayed upstairs on a conference call, but after about 20 minutes, I heard him calling for me with this edge in his voice that made me immediately mute my laptop. When I got down there, he was standing by the water heater with his flashlight aimed at the wall behind it, and his face had gone pale under his weathered tan. He asked me if I knew there was a space back there, and honestly, I had no idea what he was talking about until he showed me. Behind the water heater, someone had cut a hole in the drywall, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, and covered it with a piece of plywood painted to match the wall. You'd never notice it unless you were specifically looking, and even then, the water heater blocked most of it from view. Frank said he wasn't going in there, not for any amount of money, and packed up his tools faster than I've ever seen anyone move. After he left, I stood there for probably an hour, just staring at that hidden entrance with a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? That I found a hidden space in my murder house? They'd probably already searched it during the original investigation. Plus, some morbid part of me needed to know what was in there, needed to understand what I'd been living above for weeks. I pulled the water heater out just enough to squeeze behind it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and pried the plywood away from the opening. The smell that came out was musty and sweet, like old paper and something organic that had long since dried out. My flashlight beam revealed a narrow space, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a dirt floor and wooden beam supports. Someone had been living in there, or at least spending time there. There was a moldy sleeping bag in one corner, empty juice boxes scattered around, and a small pink backpack with unicorn patches half buried in the dirt. I crawled inside, even though every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out and call someone, anyone. The backpack was what drew me in, partially decomposed from moisture but still intact enough to open. Inside, I found a handful of crayons, a plastic bracelet with letter beads spelling Lily, and a small diary with a sparkly cover, the kind they sell at dollar stores. Most of the pages were stuck together from dampness, but I could make out some entries near the end that were still legible. The handwriting was careful, like a child trying their best to write neatly. An entry from about a week before the murders talked about how Daddy gets mean when he drinks the brown bottle drinks, and how Mommy cries in the bathroom but says she's okay. Another mentioned Lucas telling her about the secret space he'd found behind the water heater when they were playing hide and seek, how you could fit inside, if you were small enough. My stomach churned as I read these innocent observations from a 9-year-old who had no idea what was coming. But it was the last entry that made me drop the diary and scramble backwards out of that space so fast, I scraped my palms on the concrete. The date was the night of the murders, written in shaky pencil. "Daddy is being scary tonight. He hit Mommy and she fell down and won't wake up. Lucas tried to run, but Daddy caught him. I remembered the hiding place. I can hear him calling for me, but I won't come out. I won't let him find me this time. Now I know how to stay quiet. The wall next door is soft dirt. I can dig with the garden spoon I brought. Cora next door makes cookies on Sundays. Maybe if I dig far enough I can get to her house. I have my juice boxes and fruit snacks from lunch. I'll be quiet like when we play the quiet game." Below that was a crude drawing of what looked like a tunnel, with an arrow pointing toward a house with flowers. When I shined my flashlight toward the back corner of the space past where the sleeping bag was, I could see it clearly. A child-sized tunnel had been dug into the earth, heading in the direction of the neighbor's property. I called the police immediately, my whole body shaking as I tried to explain what I'd found. Within an hour, my house was swarming with cops, detectives, and crime scene techs. They brought in special equipment and confirmed what the diary suggested. The tunnel extended about 15 feet toward the neighbor's property before it collapsed, probably within days of being dug. The lead detective, a woman with tired eyes and gray streaks in her black hair, told me they found small bones in the collapsed section, along with a garden spoon and the remains of more juice boxes. Lily had tried to dig her way to safety, but died in that tunnel, either from the collapse or from dehydration, alone in the dark while the whole town searched for her. The neighbor, Cora, had moved to Florida 3 years ago, never knowing that a desperate little girl had been trying to reach her house, trying to reach the lady who made cookies on Sundays. They reopened the case, of course, though there wasn't much left to investigate since Robert Hartley was already dead. The media circus that followed was insane, with news vans parked outside for weeks, and my phone ringing constantly with interview requests I never answered. I stayed with my sister during the worst of it, but eventually, I had to go back. Not to live. I could never sleep in that house again, but to pack everything up and sign it back over to the bank. They offered to let me out of the mortgage without penalty given the circumstances, and I took it without hesitation. Before I left for the last time, I stood in that basement and thought about Lily, how she'd been brave enough to hide, smart enough to try to escape, but ultimately just a scared 9-year-old who wanted to get to the nice neighbor lady's house. I left flowers by the hidden entrance, white daisies because I didn't know what she liked, and whispered an apology for not finding her sooner. The house sold at auction 2 months later to a developer who tore it down and built a duplex. Sometimes I drive by and see families living there, kids playing in the yard where the cherry tree used to be, and I wonder if they know what was once buried in the earth beneath their feet, or if some stories are better left untold. My realtor kept checking his watch while handing me the keys to the Victorian on Sycamore Drive, like he had somewhere more important to be than closing on a property that had been sitting empty for 3 years. I'd graduated college in 2007, right into the recession, and it took me until 41 to save enough for even this foreclosure in northern Michigan, a house the previous owner had abandoned along with everything they owned. I remember thinking that was strange, leaving furniture and clothes and dishes behind, but the price was right, and I needed somewhere to start over after my marriage fell apart. That Friday in October, I pulled into the cracked driveway with my car loaded down with cleaning supplies and power tools, ready to spend the weekend gutting the place and making it livable. I chose the master bedroom first because I needed at least one decent room to sleep in while I worked on the rest. The wallpaper looked like something from a fever dream, this sickly green pattern of flowers that seemed to shift in your peripheral vision, peeling away from the walls in long tongues. When I got my scraper under the edges, whole sections came off like dead skin, revealing another layer underneath. Baby blue roses this time. Then below that, a stripe pattern in brown and gold. Layer after layer, 7 deep by my count, each one someone else's attempt to cover up what came before. My shoulders burned from reaching up to the crown molding, and the floor around me looked like a paper graveyard, but I kept scraping, needing to see the original wall, needing to get down to something solid and real. When I finally reached what should have been plaster, my scraper hit something that made me step back. The wall wasn't white or beige or any normal color. It was stained dark brown in irregular patches, and the stains had a texture to them, thick and flaky like old paint that had bubbled and dried. I grabbed my work light and held it close, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when the pattern became clear. Handprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed into the wall in what looked like dried blood, overlapping each other in a chaotic sprawl that went from floor to ceiling. Some were adult-sized, fingers spread wide like they were pushing against something, but others were small, child-sized, and those made my throat close up because they weren't just pressed against the wall, they were dragging downward, leaving streaks like someone had been sliding down. I told myself it had to be paint, some weird art project from the 60s when people did stuff like that. But when I touched one of the prints with my fingernail, dark flakes came off and the smell hit me, metallic and organic and wrong. The handprints weren't random either. They formed a path along the wall, leading toward the corner where the floor met the ceiling, climbing up like whoever made them had been trying to get somewhere impossible. I started following them with my light, documenting everything with my phone because I knew no one would believe this, and I noticed that some of the prints had something embedded in them, tiny white fragments that caught the light. I pulled out a pair of tweezers from my toolkit and carefully extracted one, and it was a fingernail, an actual human fingernail, torn off at the quick and stuck in the dried blood like a confession. My first instinct was to call the police, but I kept thinking about how this would look. Me alone in this house with what might be evidence of something terrible, and I needed to know more before I brought anyone else into this. I grabbed a bottle of industrial cleaner and a scrub brush, thinking maybe if I could just clean one section, I could see how deep the stains went. But when I started scrubbing, the blood didn't fade. It seemed to activate somehow, releasing that copper smell even stronger. The handprints near the floor were different from the ones higher up, more frantic, fingers splayed at impossible angles, and I realized they continued under the baseboard. I got my pry bar and worked one of the boards loose, and behind it the blood wasn't just on the wall. It had soaked into the insulation, forming dark crystals that crumbled when I touched them. That's when I noticed the floor itself felt wrong under my knees, hollow in places where it should have been solid. I knocked on different sections with my knuckles, listening for the sound to change, and found a spot about 3 feet from the wall where the board sounded completely empty underneath. The wood there was slightly newer than the rest, maybe 10 years old instead of the original 100-year-old oak, and someone had tried to match the stain but hadn't quite gotten it right. I worked my pry bar into the seam between 2 boards and lifted, and the smell that came up made me gag, sweet and chemical like formaldehyde mixed with decay. Under the floorboards was a shallow space, maybe 8 inches deep, that shouldn't have existed according to the house's original blueprints I'd seen at the closing. Inside that space, arranged with a precision that made my skin prickle, were small bones, definitely not from any animal I recognized, too delicate and too specifically shaped. Mixed in with the bones were locks of hair, each one tied with a different colored ribbon, red and blue and yellow and green, like someone had been collecting them over years. The hair ranged from platinum blonde to deep black, some straight, some curled, all different textures and lengths, and each bundle was labeled with a tiny paper tag written in cramped handwriting I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. But what really made me scramble backward was the stack of Polaroid photographs, maybe 30 of them, bound together with a rubber band that disintegrated when I touched it, scattering the photos across the hidden space like playing cards. The photos showed people sleeping in beds, all taken from the same angle, standing at the foot of the bed looking down at them. Different people, different decades based on the hairstyles and the quality of the film, but always in the same room, this room, I could tell from the distinctive crown molding and the way the window sat off-center in the wall. Men, women, even a few children, all captured in that vulnerable state of deep sleep, mouths slightly open, completely unaware they were being photographed. The dates written on the white borders went back to the 80s, but as I flipped through them, getting closer to the bottom of the stack, the dates got more recent, 2015, 2017, last year, and then I found one that made everything inside me turn to ice. It was me, taken last night, asleep in the hotel room I'd stayed at before coming to the house this morning. The same angle, the same composition, but I'd been alone in that room with the door locked and chained. I dropped the photo and backed away from the hole in the floor, my mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same conclusion. Someone had been in my hotel room, someone who knew I was coming here, someone who'd been doing this for decades. The realtor's eagerness to hand over the keys suddenly made sense, and I remembered how he'd mentioned the previous owner's disappearance like it was just another detail, not the massive red flag it should have been. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but there was no signal, which was impossible because I'd had full bars just an hour ago when I'd texted my sister a photo of the house's exterior. The landline downstairs that I'd seen during the walkthrough, an old rotary phone that the realtor said still worked. That was my only option, so I started toward the bedroom door, stepping carefully around the exposed cavity in the floor. That's when I heard it, a sound from directly below me, in what should have been the living room ceiling but was clearly another hidden space. It was a scratching noise, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone writing with chalk on a blackboard, and it was getting louder. I looked down through the hole I'd opened and saw that the bones and photos weren't sitting on solid wood like I'd thought. They were resting on another layer of newer boards, and through the gaps between those boards I could see movement, something pale shifting in the darkness below. The scratching stopped, and then I heard breathing, wet and labored, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to catch their breath, and the pale thing below moved again, resolving into fingers, human fingers, pressing up against the boards from underneath, testing them, finding the weak spots. I ran then, not caring about evidence or explanations, just needing to get out of that house before whatever was below found its way up. My feet hit the stairs hard enough to crack the old wood, and I could hear the scratching following me, moving through the walls themselves, keeping pace as I descended. The front door was exactly as I'd left it, slightly ajar from when I'd carried in my supplies, but when I grabbed the handle to yank it fully open, it wouldn't budge, like someone had nailed it shut from the outside while I was upstairs discovering the truth about this place. Behind me I heard wood splintering, boards being pushed up from below, and a voice, hoarse and barely human, saying my name, not calling it but tasting it, like it was something they'd been waiting years to say out loud. The window in the living room was my only option, one of those old double-hung types with the wavy glass that distorted everything outside. I grabbed a hammer from my tool bag and swung it hard, shattering the glass in a shower of fragments that caught the afternoon light like crystals. I could hear footsteps now, uneven and dragging, coming from the hallway, and when I glanced back, I saw him, the realtor, except his clothes were different, older, covered in dust and something darker, and his face was wrong, too pale, too thin, like he'd been living in those spaces between the walls for years, feeding on whatever those bones had once been. He smiled at me with teeth that were too sharp and too many, holding up a new Polaroid camera, the flash already charging with a high-pitched whine, and I understood then that the previous owner hadn't disappeared. They'd never left. They'd just moved deeper into the house's hidden architecture, waiting for the next person desperate enough to buy a too-good-to-be-true foreclosure. I dove through the window frame just as the camera flash exploded behind me, the light so bright, it left purple afterimages dancing across my vision even with my eyes closed. Glass tore through my jacket and jeans as I hit the porch roof and rolled, then dropped the 8 feet to the dead lawn below, landing hard enough to knock the wind out of me. But adrenaline got me moving, got me running to my car with keys already in my hand, and I could hear him behind me, that wet breathing getting closer, but he stopped at the property line, just stood there at the edge of the yard watching as I fumbled with the ignition. In my rearview mirror as I peeled out, I saw him walk back into the house, patient, unhurried, already preparing for the next buyer, and I realized he'd been playing this game for decades, maybe longer, and the house would go back on the market soon enough, priced to move, perfect for someone starting over. I drove straight to the state police barracks in Grayling and filed a report, showed them the photos on my phone, the fingernail I'd pocketed, even the fresh cuts from the window glass. But when they sent officers to investigate, the house was empty, normal. Just dusty rooms and old furniture, no blood on the walls, no hidden spaces in the floor, nothing but a standard foreclosure property that had been on the market for months. The realtor's office had no record of anyone by the name he'd given me, and the business card he'd handed me at closing had somehow turned blank in my wallet, just white cardstock with nothing printed on it. They suggested stress, suggested therapy, suggested maybe I'd had some kind of episode, but I know what I saw, what I found, and what still visits me some nights, because I'll wake up to find fresh Polaroid photos on my nightstand, pictures of me sleeping in my new apartment 2 states away, each one labeled with yesterday's date, each one telling me that the property line was just a courtesy, not a boundary, and that some sales, once made, can never really be undone. Everyone said I was crazy for buying that Victorian on Chestnut Avenue, especially sight unseen from an estate auction. But after my company relocated me to Portland in spring of 2022, I needed something to keep me busy on weekends. 29 and recently divorced, rattling around in some sterile apartment wasn't how I planned to start this new chapter. When I saw the listing photos of peeling wallpaper, original hardwood floors buried under decades of grime, and that gorgeous wraparound porch practically begging to be restored, I knew I'd found my project. My brother Kevin flew out from Denver to help with the initial assessment, took one look at the place, and immediately started listing all the reasons I should run. But something about those tall ceilings and arched doorways spoke to me, whispered promises of what it could become with enough sweat and determination. I started with the main parlor that first Saturday in June, the room where the previous owners had installed this hideous electric fireplace insert sometime in the 70s, completely butchering what must have been a beautiful original hearth. Crowbar in hand, safety goggles fogging up from the heat, I began prying away the aluminum frame, revealing layers of different materials like geological strata of bad home improvement decisions. Behind the insert, someone had sloppily mortared in regular red bricks, not even attempting to match the original masonry work. And as I started chipping away at them, I noticed something strange. These bricks weren't just closing off the chimney opening. They continued up into the flue itself, packed tight and deliberate, as if someone wanted to make absolutely sure nothing could ever come down, or up, through that space again. Each swing of my hammer sent chunks of mortar raining down, coating me in 100-year-old dust that turned my hair gray and stuck to the sweat on my arms. After about an hour of steady work, I'd cleared enough bricks to shine my work light up into the chimney, and what I saw made me pause mid-swing. The flue wasn't just blocked. Someone had built what looked like a false floor about 4 feet up, creating a hidden cavity between the original fireplace opening and this makeshift barrier. My first thought was maybe someone had stashed valuables up there during the Depression, or perhaps Prohibition-era bottles, the kind of discovery that would make this whole renovation worth it. I texted Kevin a photo, joking that I might have just found our retirement fund, and he replied with a string of $sign emojis, telling me to be careful not to damage anything valuable. It took another 2 hours to clear enough space to actually reach into the cavity, and by then, the afternoon sun was slanting through the parlor windows, casting long shadows across the debris-covered floor. I stuck my arm up through the opening, feeling around blindly in the dark space above, my fingers brushing against what felt like rough burlap or canvas. When I managed to grab hold and pull, a child's shoe tumbled out, landing with a soft thud on the plastic sheet I'd laid down. Not just any shoe, but a tiny leather boot. The kind with buttons up the side that kids wore maybe 100 years ago, still laced up tight as if someone had just taken it off. The leather was stiff and cracked, covered in a layer of grime that had turned it almost black, and there was something unsettling about how perfectly preserved it was, like it had been waiting there all this time. I reached back up into the cavity, this time more cautiously, my fingers exploring the space with the kind of careful touch you'd use to check if a stove is still hot. More shoes came tumbling down, one after another, each one small, each one different, some with worn-down heels, others barely scuffed like they'd only been worn once or twice. 7 pairs in total, arranged in what must have been a deliberate pattern up there, though now they lay scattered across my plastic sheet like evidence at a crime scene. The strangest part was how they were all different sizes, ranging from what looked like a toddler's first walking shoes to maybe a child of 10 or 11, and none of them matched, not a single pair among them. I knelt there, surrounded by these tiny shoes, and felt this creeping sensation working its way up my spine, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're looking at something that has a story, a bad story, one that nobody wanted told. Against every instinct telling me to stop, to call someone, maybe the police or at least Kevin, I grabbed my work light and hoisted myself up to look directly into the cavity. The smell hit me first, dry and stale, like opening an attic that's been sealed for decades, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. When the beam of my light swept across the space, I saw that the walls weren't just brick and mortar. They were covered in scratches, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved deep into the old bricks in frantic, overlapping patterns. Some looked like tally marks, groups of 5 with the diagonal slash through them, covering one section of wall from top to bottom. Others were more chaotic, desperate gouges that had left grooves so deep you could fit a finger in them. And in several places there were dark stains embedded in these scratches, rusty brown streaks that had seeped into the porous brick. My light caught something white in the corner, and when I focused the beam, I nearly lost my grip and fell backward off the ladder. Teeth. Small human teeth scattered across the floor of the cavity like someone had emptied a jar of baby teeth, except there were too many, far too many for just one child. They were everywhere, dozens of them, some still pearly white, others yellowed with age, a few with dark cavities or broken in half. Mixed in with them were what looked like fingernails, tiny crescents that had turned brittle and translucent over time, and when I shifted my light, I could see more embedded in the mortar between the bricks, pressed in like decorations in some sick mosaic. My breathing had gone shallow, and I could hear my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to process what I was looking at, tried to make it make sense in some way that didn't involve what my brain was screaming at me. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and started taking photos, the flash illuminating the cavity in stark, horrible detail with each shot. That's when I noticed the writing, scratched into the bricks near what would have been the top of the original fireplace opening. Most of it was illegible, just frantic scratching, but I could make out dates, 1897, 1903, 1911, and names or parts of names. Tom, Margar, Eli, scratched by different hands, some in childish scrawl, others more desperate and jagged. Below them all, carved deeper and more deliberately than the rest, someone had written, "They make us climb," in letters that must have taken hours to gouge into the brick. The photo I took of those words came out blurry because I couldn't hold the phone steady, and when I tried to take another, I heard something shift in the cavity, a soft sliding sound like fabric against brick, even though I knew nothing could be moving in there. I scrambled down from the ladder so fast I knocked over my toolbox, sending hammers and screwdrivers clattering across the hardwood floor. Standing there in my own living room, covered in century-old dust and trying to catch my breath, I called Kevin, but when he answered, I couldn't form the words to explain what I'd found. How do you tell someone that your house has a chimney full of children's teeth and fingernails, that the walls are covered in desperate scratches from kids who were made to climb up into that dark space for God knows what reason? He kept asking if I was okay, said I sounded weird, and finally I just told him to come over right away, that I'd found something bad, really bad, and hung up before he could ask questions. While I waited, I stood guard in front of the fireplace like something might crawl out of it, unable to look away from that dark opening I'd created. Kevin arrived in 20 minutes, which must have been some kind of record from his apartment across town, and the look on his face when he saw me, wild-eyed and dust-covered, would have been funny under different circumstances. I handed him my phone with the photos pulled up, and watched his expression change from confusion to disgust to horror as he swiped through them. He wanted to look for himself, said maybe I was misinterpreting what I'd seen, that there had to be some explanation. But when he climbed up and looked into that cavity, he came down even faster than I had, his face pale and his jaw clenched tight. We argued about calling the police right then, but Kevin pointed out that whatever had happened in there was clearly historical, decades old at least, and we should try to find out more about the house's history first, maybe contact the Historical Society or check old newspapers, because involving the cops would mean our renovation would turn into a crime scene investigation. We spent the rest of that night at the Portland Library's archives section, going through old newspapers on microfilm until our eyes burned from staring at the screen. It was Kevin who found it first, an article from 1913 about a local chimney sweep named Theodore Blackwood, who'd been arrested after a child died falling from a roof. The article mentioned he'd been using orphans and street children as climbing boys, forcing them up into chimneys to clean them from the inside, a practice that had been outlawed for decades, but apparently continued in secret. The boy who died, 7-year-old Thomas Garrett, had gotten stuck in a flue and suffocated before they could tear the chimney apart to reach him. But here's what made us both go cold. The article said this wasn't Blackwood's first incident, that several children had gone missing over the years while working for him, and neighbors had complained about strange crying sounds coming from houses after he'd done work there. The address mentioned in the article as one of his regular clients was 447 Chestnut Avenue, my house. The police never found the missing children, according to the follow-up articles we found, and Blackwood was only convicted of manslaughter for the one death they could prove, serving just 3 years before disappearing from Portland entirely. But we found his obituary from 1924, died in a fire at a boarding house in Seattle, and there was a quote from his landlady saying he'd been raving about the children in the walls and their little fingers scratching right before the fire started. Kevin and I looked at each other across that library table, both thinking the same thing. Those kids never made it out of the chimneys they were forced to clean, and someone, maybe Blackwood himself or maybe someone who discovered what he'd done, had sealed up that fireplace to keep the evidence hidden. We called the police the next morning, and within hours my house was crawling with investigators, forensic teams, even an anthropologist who specialized in historical remains. They confirmed what we'd suspected, finding bone fragments mixed in with the teeth and fingernails, and they eventually identified at least 4 different children based on DNA analysis, though they said there could have been more. The investigation lasted months, and though they couldn't match the remains to any specific missing persons cases from that era, they gave the children a proper burial in a ceremony that made the national news. I sold the house as soon as the investigation wrapped up, taking a massive loss but not caring, because I knew I'd never sleep soundly there again. Never stop imagining those kids trapped in that dark space, scratching at the bricks until their fingers bled, leaving their desperate message for someone, anyone, to find them over a century later. November of 2023 was when I finally pulled the trigger on buying my first house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch at the end of Birchwood Circle. After my promotion to regional sales manager earlier that year, I could finally afford something decent, and this place checked all the boxes. Quiet neighborhood, mature trees, that classic American dream setup with the cul-de-sac where kids could play street hockey without worrying about through traffic. My realtor, a chatty woman named Deborah, mentioned the house had been on the market for 8 months, which seemed odd given how nice it was. But she said the seller was motivated and I wasn't about to question my good fortune. Moving in felt like starting fresh at 34. especially after the disaster of my previous apartment situation with roommates who thought dirty dishes were decorative art. I remember thinking this was it, the real adult beginning I'd been working toward since college. My first week there, I met the Prestons next door while I was trying to figure out why my lawnmower wouldn't start. Keith Preston walked over with his teenage son Nathan, both of them wearing matching polo shirts like they'd stepped out of a catalog, and within 5 minutes, Keith had the mower purring like new. His wife Melissa brought over brownies that evening with their daughter Grace, maybe 12 years old, who kept twirling her hair around her finger while staring at me with these huge green eyes. They seemed like the perfect suburban family, almost aggressively normal in that way, that makes you wonder if they practice their smiles in the mirror. Keith worked in insurance, Melissa homeschooled the kids, they invited me to their church, their barbecues, even offered to collect my mail when I traveled for work. I thought I'd hit the neighbor jackpot, especially compared to my last place where the guy upstairs played death metal at 3 in the morning and the couple next door had screaming matches that could wake the dead. Everything changed on my 9th night in the house when my bladder woke me up around 2:45. I stumbled to the bathroom, still mostly asleep, and as I passed my bedroom window, something outside caught my eye. There in my backyard, right at the edge where my property met theirs, stood all 4 Prestons in a perfect line. Keith on the left, then Melissa, Nathan, and little Grace on the end, all of them in their pajamas despite the 40-degree weather. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there staring directly at my bedroom window with their arms hanging straight down at their sides like mannequins someone had arranged on my lawn. The moonlight hit their faces in this awful way that made their eyes look completely black, and none of them were blinking. Not once in the whole minute I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. I actually rubbed my eyes like some cartoon character, because this had to be a dream, or maybe I was having some kind of episode from the stress of moving. But when I looked again, they were still there, and now I could see their breath making little clouds in the cold air, which somehow made it worse because it proved they were real. They were alive. They were choosing to stand there in the freezing dark, staring at my window. My first instinct was to open the window and yell down at them, ask what the hell they were doing, but something in my gut told me not to let them know I was awake. Instead, I grabbed my phone and started recording, keeping the screen brightness all the way down so they wouldn't see the glow. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., and I filmed them for 5 solid minutes, during which they never moved, never shifted their weight, never even seemed to breathe deeply enough to move their shoulders. At exactly 3:05 a.m., like someone had flipped a switch, they all turned in perfect synchronization and walked single file back to their house. Not a word between them, not a glance at each other. Just this robotic march through the gap in our fence and into their back door. I stayed at that window for another hour, replaying the video over and over, zooming in on their faces, trying to find something that would make this make sense. Were they sleepwalking? Some kind of religious thing? A prank? But the way they'd stood there, the precision of it, the way little Grace hadn't fidgeted even once when normally she couldn't sit still for 30 seconds, none of it added up to anything rational. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat there with every light in my bedroom on, waiting for sunrise like it would somehow erase what I'd seen. Next morning, I was running on coffee and adrenaline when Keith knocked on my door to borrow my hedge clippers. He looked exactly like he always did. Khakis and a button-down, that practiced smile, asking about my work trip next week and whether I'd caught the game last night. I wanted to grab him by his perfectly pressed collar and demand an explanation, but instead, I heard myself making small talk while studying his face for any sign that he knew I'd seen them. When I casually mentioned I'd had trouble sleeping, asked if they'd heard any weird noises around 3 a.m., he just tilted his head like a confused golden retriever and said they'd all been dead to the world by 10:30. Melissa appeared behind him with a casserole dish, said I looked tired, insisted I take her homemade lasagna, and the normalcy of it all made me question my own sanity. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe the stress of buying a house had triggered some kind of hallucination. Maybe I needed to lay off the late-night coffee. But that night, I set up my laptop facing the window with the camera recording, and sure enough, at 2:47 a.m. on the dot, there they were again. Same formation, same vacant stares, same 18 minutes of absolute stillness before their synchronized departure. This time I noticed more details through the zoom lens. They were barefoot despite the frost on the grass. Their pajamas were different from the night before, so this wasn't some weird recording or trick of light. And their eyes never tracked anything, just stayed locked on my exact window even though my blinds were drawn. I watched it happen every single night for a week, building up a folder of recordings labeled by date, each one showing the same exact pattern. During the day, they remained the picture-perfect neighbors, and I became an increasingly paranoid mess, drinking energy drinks to stay functional at work while setting up more cameras, different angles, even a motion sensor that confirmed 4 human heat signatures standing in formation for exactly 18 minutes. On day 8, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to break the pattern. I stayed at a hotel that night, but I left my cameras running, and when I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach turned to ice. They were there at 2:47 a.m. as usual, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, stood 3 translucent figures, rippling like heat mirages but distinctly human-shaped, and they were standing in my bedroom, right where I would have been sleeping. The Prestons weren't watching me at all. They were watching something that was already inside my house, something that became visible only when I wasn't there to see it. I played that footage back 20 times, adjusting the contrast and brightness until I could make out more details of those figures, and each one had its face pressed against the inside of my bedroom window, looking out at the Prestons like they were having some kind of silent communication. I drove straight to the county records office that morning, told them I was researching my house's history for insurance purposes, and what I found made me sit down hard on their uncomfortable plastic chair. 3 previous owners, all of them dying in their sleep over the past 30 years. James Hartwell in 1994, massive heart failure at age 41. Monica Zhao in 2008, sudden respiratory arrest at 37. Douglas Brennan in 2017, brain aneurysm at 45. All of them found in the master bedroom, all of them discovered in the morning with no signs of struggle, no previous health conditions that would explain such sudden deaths. The clerk, an older woman with rhinestone glasses, leaned in close and whispered that locals called it the Nightmare House, said people would cross the street rather than walk past it. When I asked about the Prestons, she pulled up their records. They'd bought their house in 1993, 1 year before the first death, and had never once been late on property taxes, never filed a complaint, never appeared in any police reports. I spent the rest of that day in my car, parked down the street, afraid to go back inside but needing answers. Around sunset, Nathan Preston jogged past my car, and when he saw me, he stopped and tapped on my window with one knuckle, that same practiced smile on his teenage face. He asked if everything was all right, mentioned his mom was worried about me, said I hadn't been looking well lately and maybe I should get some rest. There was something in the way he said rest, drawing out the word like he was tasting it, that made every hair on my neck stand up. I told him I was fine, just work stress, and he nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact, then said something that still echoes in my head. His family had been watching over this neighborhood for a long time, making sure everyone got what they deserved, and they took their responsibilities very seriously. Then he jogged away, and I noticed he wasn't even breathing hard despite having run at least 3 miles. That night I didn't go home, stayed at the hotel again, but I kept checking my cameras through the app on my phone. At 2:47 a.m., the Prestons were there as always, but this time I could see the 3 figures in my bedroom more clearly, and they were agitated, moving around the room, pressing against the walls like they were trapped. One of them kept going to the bedroom door and back to the window, over and over, and I realized with growing horror that it was following the same path I took every night when I got up to use the bathroom. These weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were somehow recordings or echoes of the previous owners, stuck in some kind of loop, and the Prestons were keeping them contained, watching them like guards watching prisoners. When 3:05 came and the family walked back to their house, the figures in my bedroom collapsed to the floor and stayed there completely still until they faded away just before dawn. I never went back to that house. Packed everything I could fit in my car the next afternoon while the Prestons were at their church, left the rest behind, didn't even bother trying to sell the place, just stopped paying the mortgage and let the bank have it. Found out later it went back on the market after 6 months, sold to a young couple from out of state, who probably got the same great deal I did. I check the obituaries sometimes, waiting to see their names, wondering if the Prestons are still standing guard every night, still making sure everyone gets what they deserve, whatever that means. Some nights I wake up at exactly 2:47 a.m. wherever I'm living, and I wonder if they're watching someone else now, or if those things in the bedroom are still there, still trapped, still walking the same paths their bodies walked before they died. All I know for certain is that the Prestons knew exactly what they were doing, had been doing it for 30 years, and they'll keep doing it until someone stops them, or until there's no one left to watch. When I graduated college in 2012, buying a house seemed impossible. But estate sales change everything when someone dies without family to claim their stuff. The Holloway property sat on Riverside Lane for 6 weeks before I saw the listing. A 3-bedroom ranch with original hardwood floors and a price tag that made my real estate agent do a double take. Mrs. Violet Holloway had died at 93, alone, and the state needed to liquidate her assets fast. I toured it on a Wednesday morning in April, signed papers by Friday, and moved in the following week with my cat, Pepper, and whatever furniture fit in my sedan. The neighborhood felt sleepy in that comfortable way, with tall oaks lining the street and neighbors who waved but didn't pry. I worked remotely as a software developer, which meant my days blended together in a comfortable routine of coffee, code, and video calls. The house needed work, sure, but it was mine. The first note appeared 4 days after I moved in. I woke up around 7, stumbled toward the kitchen for coffee, and nearly stepped on the small rectangle of paper lying just inside the front door. The handwriting was shaky, done in pencil on what looked like paper torn from an old notebook, the edges rough and uneven. It said, "You changed the kitchen." That was it. No signature, no explanation. I picked it up, turned it over, found nothing else. My stomach did this weird flip because, yeah, I had changed the kitchen. The avocado green cabinets were the first thing I painted over, replacing them with clean white. I told myself it was probably a former neighbor, someone who had been close to Mrs. Holloway and felt sentimental about the house. Maybe they had a key from years ago. I checked the locks anyway, made sure everything was secure, and tossed the note in the recycling. Weird, but not worth panicking over. People get attached to places. I got that. The second note came 3 days later. Same paper, same pencil, same shaky handwriting slipped under the door sometime during the night. "I don't like your furniture." This one hit different because how would someone know what furniture I had unless they were looking through my windows? I checked every window in the house, made sure the curtains were drawn at night, and started feeling paranoid about the big bay window in the living room that faced the street. My couch was new, a gray sectional I bought on sale because the old floral one from Mrs. Holloway's estate sale photos gave me the creeps. I called a locksmith that afternoon, had him change every single lock in the house, deadbolts included. He was this older guy with calloused hands who told me the previous locks were original to the house, probably 40 years old, easy to pick if someone knew what they were doing. That made me feel better and worse at the same time. Better because new locks meant security. Worse because it confirmed someone could have been getting in. I started paying attention to everything. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow that moved wrong, every car that parked too long on the street. My work suffered because I kept getting up during meetings to check the doors, to peer out windows, to make sure Pepper was not freaking out about something I could not see. She was a good cat, usually chill, but she started acting strange around the same time the notes began. She would sit in the hallway staring at the basement door, ears flat, tail puffed. I had not gone down to the basement much since moving in. It was unfinished. Just concrete and exposed beams. Boxes of Mrs. Holloway's things the estate sale people did not bother with, and a musty smell that made my nose itch. But Pepper's behavior made me nervous, so I propped a chair under the basement doorknob at night, told myself I was being ridiculous, and barely slept anyway. The third note showed up on a Monday morning, and this one made my heart pound so hard I thought I might pass out. You sleep on the wrong side. Wrong side of what? The bed? How could anyone possibly know which side of the bed I slept on, unless they had been in my bedroom standing there watching me while I was unconscious and vulnerable? I grabbed my phone with shaking fingers and called the police. The officer who came out was polite but useless, a young guy named Officer Davison, who walked through the house, checked the windows, and basically told me that without evidence of forced entry or actual threat, there was not much they could do. He suggested I install security cameras, gave me a case number, and left. I wanted to scream at him that someone was in my house, that these notes proved it, but his bored expression told me he thought I was paranoid or looking for attention. The moment he drove away, I ordered cameras online, the expensive kind with night vision and motion sensors, paid extra for next-day delivery. I installed 4 cameras by myself the following evening. One pointed at the front door, one at the back door, one covering the living room and hallway, and one in my bedroom because I needed to know if someone was coming in while I slept. The app on my phone would alert me to any motion, save the footage to the cloud, and give me something concrete to show the police when this creep slipped up. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The cameras caught me walking around in pajamas, Pepper jumping on furniture, shadows from car headlights passing outside. Normal stuff. I started to relax, started to think maybe the new locks had scared whoever it was away. Then on the 3rd night, I woke up at 4 in the morning to find another note on the floor by my bed. Not under the front door this time. By my bed, 6 feet from where I had been sleeping. The note said, "The cameras won't help." My whole body went cold. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the camera app with trembling fingers, and scrolled through the footage from the night. Nothing. Hours of nothing. Me sleeping, Pepper curled at my feet. Darkness. Silence. No one entered my room. No one came through the door or the window. The timestamp showed continuous recording with no gaps, no interruptions. It was impossible. I sat on my bed until the sun came up, unable to process what was happening, trying to find a logical explanation that did not exist. Someone was inside my house, someone who knew about the cameras, someone who could move around without triggering a single motion sensor. I called in sick to work, could not even pretend to focus on code when my hands would not stop shaking. I needed help. I called my brother, Andrew, who lived 2 hours away. He thought I was overreacting until I sent him photos of all 4 notes. He said he would drive up that weekend, stay with me, help me figure it out, but I could not wait that long. That afternoon, I started searching the house top to bottom, looking for any opening, any gap, any way someone could be getting inside. I checked every closet, every cabinet, moved furniture, looked behind appliances. When I got to the basement, I almost turned back. That musty smell was stronger, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the space. Pepper refused to follow me down the stairs, just sat at the top, meowing in this anxious way that made my skin prickle. The basement was bigger than I remembered, cluttered with old boxes labeled in faded marker, Christmas decorations, clothes, books. I moved things around, checked the walls, and that's when I noticed something odd about the far corner. The concrete wall had a seam, barely visible, like someone had cut a section and fitted it back. I ran my fingers along the edge, felt it give slightly, and my pulse started hammering in my ears. I pushed against the panel and it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark opening and a set of wooden stairs leading down into nothing. The smell that came up was worse than musty. It was human, lived in. The scent of sweat and unwashed clothes and something else I could not identify. My legs felt like they might give out, but I forced myself to pull out my phone, turn on the flashlight, and descend those stairs. Each step creaked under my weight and the air got colder the farther down I went. The sublevel was not large, maybe 15 feet by 20, with a low ceiling that made me hunch. There was a mattress on the floor with rumpled blankets, a camping lantern, scattered food wrappers, empty water bottles. Someone had been living here. Someone was still living here. On the wall, taped up like some kind of sick gallery, were photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of me carrying boxes into the house on moving day, me painting the kitchen cabinets, me sitting on my couch with my laptop, me asleep in my bed, all taken from angles inside the house. My breathing came fast and shallow, and I felt dizzy like the walls were closing in. There was a small desk in the corner, and on it sat a leather journal, worn and cracked with age. I did not want to touch it, did not want to know, but my hand reached out anyway. The handwriting inside matched the notes, that same shaky scrawl, page after page of entries dated back years. The first entries were from 2003, written by someone named Albert Holloway, Mrs. Holloway's son. I remembered the estate lawyer mentioning him briefly, saying he had died in a car accident in 2005, that Mrs. Holloway had lived alone for decades after losing her only child. But here was his journal, and the entries kept going past 2005, past 2010, past 2020. The recent ones were disturbing, talking about his mother dying, about the house being sold, about me. The last entry was dated yesterday, written in that shaky hand. She doesn't know I never left. I dropped the journal and ran. I did not think, did not plan, just scrambled up those stairs through the basement up to the main floor, grabbed Pepper and my car keys, and got out of that house. I sat in my car in the driveway, shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone, and called 911. This time I did not get a bored officer. I got 3 squad cars, an ambulance on standby, and eventually a SWAT team because I told them someone was living in my basement and had been stalking me for weeks. They went in with guns drawn, cleared the main floor, then the basement, then found the hidden panel. I watched from behind a police car, clutching Pepper's carrier, as officers descended into that sub-level. They were down there for 20 minutes. When they came back up, they had a man in handcuffs, skinny and pale, with long, greasy hair and a beard that reached his chest. He looked like he was 60, but moved like someone younger. Albert Holloway. Alive. He did not struggle, did not say anything, just stared at the house as they loaded him into the police car like he was saying goodbye. The detectives told me later that Albert had faked his death in 2005, some kind of psychotic break after a fight with his mother. He had been living in that sub-level for 20 years, coming up at night when Mrs. Holloway was asleep, stealing food, using her bathroom, existing like a ghost in his own house. After she died, he just stayed, watching the estate sale people come and go, watching me move in, furious that I was changing his home. The surveillance photos went back to my first day there. He had been watching me sleep, eat, work, live, from hidden vents and gaps in the walls that connected to his little dungeon. They found tools down there, books, even a small radio. A whole life built in secret. I sold the house within a month, took a loss, did not care. Albert was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, a bunch of other things. Last I heard, he was in a psychiatric facility. I live in an apartment now, 4th floor, new building, no basements. I check every wall for seams. I probably always will. The auctioneer's gavel hit the podium at $63,000, and just like that, I owned 4 acres of overgrown Wisconsin farmland with a house I'd only seen in grainy photographs. My ex-wife would have called it insane, dropping that kind of money on a property site unseen, but that was exactly why I did it. The divorce papers had been signed for 2 months, and every street corner in Madison reminded me of something I wanted to forget. I needed space, literal and mental, somewhere I could tear things apart and rebuild them however I wanted. The real estate agent met me at the property 3 weeks later, handing over the keys with an apologetic expression that should have been my first warning. She mentioned the previous owner had died in a nursing home, that the place had sat empty since 2011, that I'd need to do extensive clearing before it resembled anything livable. She wasn't exaggerating. When I pulled up that Friday afternoon in May with my German Shepherd mix Charlie riding shotgun, the farmhouse looked like something from a horror movie set. White paint peeled off in long strips, the porch sagged dangerously on one side, and the windows were so caked with grime they reflected nothing but dark squares. The yard had disappeared entirely under waist-high grass and weeds, thick enough that I couldn't see where the property line ended. Charlie bolted from the truck the second I opened the door, vanishing into that jungle of overgrowth with his tail high. I grabbed my toolbox and started hacking a path to the front door, sweat soaking through my shirt within minutes. Inside wasn't much better. Dust covered every surface in a thick blanket, the hardwood floors were scarred and stained, and the kitchen appliances looked like relics from the Nixon administration. But the structure felt solid, the rooms had good light, and when I stood in the empty living room I heard absolutely nothing. No traffic, no neighbors, no voices, just wind moving through the fields. I set up an air mattress in the largest bedroom on the first floor, the one with windows overlooking the backyard, and fell asleep that night to the sound of Charlie's steady breathing beside me. The real work started that weekend. I spent Saturday morning just mapping out what needed to be done, walking the property line with a machete I'd bought specifically for clearing brush. The backyard was the worst of it, a solid acre of tangled weeds, wild grass, and volunteer trees that had sprouted up in the years of neglect. An old wooden shed stood near the back fence, its roof partially collapsed, surrounded by vegetation so thick I almost missed it entirely. I decided to start there, figuring if I could clear around the outbuildings first, the rest would feel less overwhelming. Charlie followed me everywhere, nose to the ground, investigating every smell with that intense focus dogs get when they're onto something interesting. Around noon, while I was pulling up a stubborn patch of thistle near the shed, he started digging. Not the casual pawing dogs do when they're bored, but aggressive, purposeful digging, sending dirt flying behind him in huge sprays. I called him off twice, but he kept returning to that same spot, a patch of ground about 6 feet from the shed's east wall. His paws worked frantically and he made these low whining sounds in his throat, the kind he'd never made before. I finally walked over and grabbed his collar, pulling him back to examine what had him so fixated. The dirt there looked different, darker and more compact than the surrounding soil, almost like it had been disturbed and then settled differently over time. I figured maybe the previous owner had buried trash there, or maybe there was an old septic line Charlie could smell. I stuck a shovel in to move him along, planning to just fill the hole back in. The blade sank into the earth easier than it should have, hitting something solid about 2 feet down. Not rock solid, but something with give to it, wrapped in something that crinkled. My first thought was garbage bags, maybe old lawn waste the previous owner had been too lazy to haul away. I dug wider, clearing more dirt, and that's when I saw the edge of it. Thick plastic sheeting, the industrial kind, yellowed with age and soil. I should have stopped right there. Should have filled it back in and called someone, or just left it alone entirely. But curiosity works like a hook, and once it's in you, it pulls. I cleared more earth away, working carefully now, and the plastic became more visible, wrapped around something large and distinctly shaped. The afternoon sun beat down on my neck as I squatted there, hands covered in dirt staring at what I'd uncovered. Then the smell hit me, faint but unmistakable even after all these years. That sweet, sick odor of decay that never fully leaves once organic matter has broken down. My stomach turned, and I stood up fast, the shovel dropping from my hand. Charlie had stopped digging and was sitting about 10 feet away, watching me with his ears pinned back. I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking fingers and dialed 911, my voice coming out steadier than I expected when the dispatcher answered. I told her I'd found something buried in my yard, that I thought it might be human remains, and she kept me on the line while she sent units out. The sheriff's department arrived within 30 minutes, 2 deputies followed by a detective named Vogt, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with gray streaking through her dark hair. She took one look at the partial excavation, made a phone call, and within an hour my backyard had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape, evidence markers, a team in white suits carefully removing layer after layer of dirt and plastic. They made me wait on the front porch with Charlie while they worked, and I sat there for hours, watching vehicles come and go, watching more people show up with cameras and equipment. Detective Vogt came to talk to me around sunset, her face giving nothing away. She asked how long I'd owned the property, whether I knew the previous owner, whether I'd noticed anything unusual beyond what Charlie had dug up. I answered everything honestly, showed her my auction paperwork, explained that I'd moved in less than a week ago. She nodded, taking notes, then told me they'd confirmed human remains, mostly skeletal at this point, wrapped in plastic and buried approximately 3 feet deep. They'd also found personal effects with the body. A wallet, she said, with identification inside. The name on the driver's license was Howard Ernest Shipley, issued in 1984, expiration date stamped 1987. The photo showed a thin man with dark hair and a mustache, the kind of grainy Department of Motor Vehicles picture that makes everyone look vaguely criminal. Detective Vogt showed me a photocopy while we sat at my kitchen table 2 days later, after the remains had been removed and the forensics team had finished processing the scene. She'd come back to ask follow-up questions, and I could tell by her body language that something wasn't adding up for her either. I asked the obvious question, who was he? She tapped her pen against her notepad and said that was the problem. Howard Ernest Shipley had no missing person report filed anywhere in the state. No family members had ever reported him gone, no employers, no friends. The address on his license traced to an apartment building in Milwaukee that had been torn down in 1993. They'd run his social security number and found he'd stopped filing taxes after 1987. No death certificate, no records of him past that year. He'd essentially vanished, and nobody had noticed or cared enough to report it. I asked how that was possible, and Vogt just shrugged, her expression tired. She said it happens more than people think, especially back then before everything was connected digitally. Someone with no close family, maybe estranged from relatives, living on the margins of society, they could disappear and leave barely a trace. She asked again if I'd found anything else unusual on the property, any other disturbed ground, anything that seemed out of place. I told her no, and she handed me her card, told me to call if anything came up. The forensics team had determined the body had been there since at least the late 80s, based on the plastic degradation and soil samples, which meant whoever buried Howard Shipley had done it decades ago, probably when the previous owner still lived here. That previous owner, an elderly man named Vernon Hastings, had died in a nursing home from Alzheimer's complications, according to the county records Vogt showed me. No family, no visitors in his final years. His property sold at auction to settle his care facility debts. If Vernon had known anything about what was buried in his backyard, he'd taken that knowledge to his grave. The investigation would continue, Vogt assured me, but without leads or witnesses, she admitted it would likely go cold. I thanked her for the information, walked her to her car, and spent the rest of that evening sitting on my porch, staring at the filled-in hole near the shed where someone had buried a human being and hidden it for 30-plus years. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday, about 10 days after they'd removed the remains. I'd been forcing myself into a routine, trying to make the house feel normal despite what had happened. I'd finished painting the living room, replaced some rotted boards on the porch, spent my days doing anything to avoid thinking about the fact that someone had died on my property and been hidden there for longer than I'd been alive. The envelope was in my mailbox when I went to check it that afternoon. Plain white, no return address. My name and address written in neat block letters with blue ink. No stamp, which meant someone had placed it directly in the box. I opened it standing right there at the end of my driveway, figuring it was probably a notice from the county or something related to the investigation. Instead, I found a single sheet of lined paper, the kind you'd tear from a spiral notebook, covered in that same precise handwriting. It read, "He begged for 3 hours before I used the hammer. You sleep 8 feet from where I made him stop. The closet in your bedroom still has the blood under the carpet. Check behind the baseboard on the north wall." My hands went numb holding that paper, the words blurring as I read them again, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly stated. I walked back to the house in a daze, Charlie following beside me, and went straight to my bedroom. The closet was empty except for the few clothes I'd hung up and some boxes I hadn't unpacked. I turned on the light and examined every inch of the carpet, a dirty beige shag that had probably been there since the 70s. Nothing looked unusual, no stains, no discoloration. I knelt down and ran my hands along the baseboard on the wall that faced north and about 3 feet from the corner. I felt it. The board was loose, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I used a screwdriver to pry it away from the wall, and the carpet behind it pulled up easily, like it had been removed and replaced before. Underneath, the original floorboards were stained dark brown, the kind of staining that soaks deep into wood grain and never fully comes out. I stared at those stains for a long time, my mind racing through the implications. Someone had written to me describing a murder, had known exactly where evidence remained, and had put that letter in my mailbox personally. I called Detective Vogt immediately, reading her the letter over the phone, and she told me to lock my doors and stay inside until she arrived. She was there within 40 minutes with 2 deputies, and they photographed everything, took the letter as evidence, and removed a section of the stained floorboard for testing. Vogt asked if I had security cameras, and when I said no, she suggested I install them immediately. The second letter came 4 days later, and this time I watched it happen. I'd been sitting in my living room around 9 in the evening, Charlie asleep on the couch beside me, when I heard the distinct metallic creak of my mailbox opening and closing. I rushed to the window but saw nothing. No car, no person, just darkness and the empty road. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, dialed Vogt's number while walking down the driveway, and found another white envelope waiting inside. This one was thicker. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carried it back to the house, keeping Vogt on the line while I opened it. Inside was another sheet of lined paper and 3 Polaroid photographs. The letter read, "The police can't help you. They don't know what I know. They weren't there when he realized nobody was coming. When he understood he'd disappear and nobody would look. I watched him figure that out, the moment it broke him." The Polaroids made my vision tunnel and my knees weaken. They were photos of my bedroom, taken from inside the closet looking out. Recent photos based on the boxes stacked against the wall, the specific way I'd arranged my furniture. One showed my bed in the darkness with me sleeping in it, the angle low and close. Someone had been standing in my closet, maybe 5 feet from where I slept, and photographed me. I didn't sleep in that house again. Vogt had deputies patrol the property hourly, and they dusted the mailbox for prints but found nothing useful, just smudges and partials that matched mine. The Polaroids were analyzed, but Polaroid film doesn't leave the kind of traceable information digital photos do. The handwriting analysis confirmed both letters were written by the same person, someone patient and deliberate, based on the consistent lettering. Vogt brought in a criminal psychologist who said the writer demonstrated detailed knowledge of the crime, likely the perpetrator or someone close to them, and was fixating on me specifically because I'd discovered the body and disrupted their secret. The psychologist suggested the killer might have visited the gravesite regularly over the years, maintaining a connection to what they'd done, and my presence had shattered that ritual. That thought terrified me more than anything else. The idea of someone standing in my yard at night, staring at the spot where they'd buried Howard Shipley decades ago, watching my windows. I moved into a motel in Madison and put the property up for sale immediately, hiring a company to pack my belongings and get them into storage. Charlie stayed with me, and I installed a security system in my motel room, cameras pointing at the door and window. Detective Fote called me every few days with updates that never went anywhere. The blood on the floorboards matched the age of the remains, but DNA degradation made it impossible to confirm it was Howard Shipley's without living relatives for comparison, and they couldn't find any. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source 5 weeks after I'd left the property. A retired postal worker named Eileen Drummond contacted the sheriff's department after seeing news coverage about the investigation. She'd worked the rural route that included my property from 1982 until 1998, and she remembered Vernon Hastings well. More importantly, she remembered his nephew, a man in his 20s who'd lived with Vernon periodically throughout the 80s, helping him maintain the property during what Eileen described as difficult periods. She remembered because the nephew made her uncomfortable, the way he'd watch her from the windows when she delivered mail, how he'd sometimes be standing at the end of the driveway waiting for her, asking strange questions about her route and schedule. She'd reported it to her supervisor once, but nothing came of it. The nephew's name was Colin Hastings, and when Vogt ran his information, she found he'd been arrested twice in the 90s for stalking and harassment, served minimal jail time both instances, and had been living in a supervised care facility near Janesville since 2013 after being declared mentally incompetent to live independently. He was 61 years old, diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoid tendencies, and according to facility records, he'd been requesting day passes every week since May, specifically asking to visit the family property in the county where my farmhouse sat. Vogt and 2 deputies went to interview Colin at the facility, and the moment they mentioned the letters, he started talking. Not confessing exactly, but speaking in circles about keeping watch and maintaining what Uncle Vernon left behind, and how I'd disturbed something that was meant to stay quiet. They searched his room with the facility's permission and found a box under his bed containing newspaper clippings about the property sale, printed satellite images of my farmhouse with dates and times written on them, and a camera loaded with Polaroid film. When confronted directly about Howard Shipley's death, Colin went silent, rocking in his chair and repeating "Uncle Vernon handled it" over and over. They couldn't get him to elaborate, but the facility director confirmed that Colin had been fixated on his uncle's old property for years, that he'd been devastated when he learned it had been sold at auction. The director also confirmed Colin had been signing himself out for supervised day passes since late spring, always requesting to go for drives in the country. The timeline matched perfectly with when I'd moved in and when the letters arrived. Folk told me they'd revoked Colin's day pass privileges permanently and were pursuing charges for criminal trespass, stalking, and harassment. As for the murder itself, Colin wasn't talking, and with Vernon dead and no other witnesses or evidence, they might never know exactly what happened to Howard Shipley that night in 1987. Only that he'd died in that house and been buried by someone who kept the secret for decades. I sold the property 3 months later at a significant loss, and honestly, I didn't care. The new owners were a young couple from Illinois who knew the full history and planned to demolish the house entirely and build new. I hope they did. I hope they tore that structure down to the foundation and started completely fresh, erasing whatever happened in that bedroom all those years ago. I moved to an apartment complex in downtown Madison, 3rd floor, with neighbors on all sides and security cameras in every hallway. Charlie adjusted better than I did, though he still sometimes stares at closed doors in a way that makes my chest tighten. I sleep with my closet door open now, always, and I've installed motion sensor lights in every room. Vogt told me last month that Colin had been transferred to a more secure facility after he tried to leave during a group outing, saying he needed to check on the property. The case of Howard Shipley's murder remains officially open, but realistically cold. Sometimes I wonder if Vernon actually killed him, or if Colin did it and Vernon helped cover it up, or if it was something else entirely that I'll never understand. What I do know is this: someone died alone and terrified in the room where I tried to sleep. and another person held on to that knowledge like a treasure for 37 years, visiting it, protecting it, obsessing over it until I accidentally dug it up and shattered their sick little ritual. I don't go near rural properties anymore. I don't even drive through the countryside if I can help it, and every time my mailbox creaks open, my whole body tenses, waiting for another white envelope that I know, logically, can't come anymore, but that some part of me will always be expecting. The whole thing happened during a phase of my life where I felt like I finally had some control over my future. I was in my mid-20s, juggling 2 jobs, and trying to build something stable with my girlfriend, Emma. We'd been saving for a long time, and when we found this old foreclosed house listed for way less than anything else in the area, it felt like a door finally opening. The place wasn't pretty, but it had this quiet charm. Wide porch, creaking steps, and an overgrown yard that hinted someone once cared. We planned to fix it up ourselves, room by room. On the day everything started, we had spent the morning clearing rubble from what used to be the dining room, joking about how we were basically starring in our own home renovation show, except with worse lighting and no budget. By late afternoon, we were tackling the hallway walls, scraping paint and marking the studs so we could map out wiring. That was when I noticed a flat patch of wall that didn't match the rest. The texture felt different, too smooth, almost deliberate, like someone had tried to make it blend in but didn't quite understand how the original builder finished their surfaces. I mentioned it to Emma, and she ran her flashlight along the spot, narrowing her eyes the way she does when she's trying to solve a puzzle. She tapped it with a knuckle, and the sound came back dull, not hollow like the rest of the wall. We exchanged this quick, excited look, thinking maybe we'd found some old hidden storage or a sealed chimney. Honestly, the possibility of any cool old house secret felt like a victory. Once we cut into the drywall, the excitement drained into something heavier. Behind the panel was a wooden door we hadn't seen anywhere on the house plans, solid, faded, and scuffed as if someone had tried to scrape something off the surface years ago. The strange part was that it opened inward, yet all 5 deadbolts were installed facing our side. Not standard locks either. These were mismatched ones, brass, steel, sliding, turning, like someone kept adding more each time they felt the previous ones weren't enough. I remember Emma muttering under her breath, not scared exactly, but unsettled in this way that made my chest tighten a little. The air around that door felt heavier, like the hallway suddenly didn't belong to the rest of the house. We hesitated for a moment, then started opening each deadbolt one by one. Some screeched like they hadn't been touched in years. Others moved too easily, as if someone had used them far more recently than we wanted to imagine. When the last lock clicked, a faint, stale smell seeped through the edges, something that reminded me of abandoned places, dust mixed with old fabric and the faint hint of something sour. Emma stepped back and let me push the door inward. It didn't resist. It just drifted open with this slow, weighted motion. That's when the beam of her flashlight caught the room beyond. Finished walls, carpet, and in the corner a narrow bed frame with a gray mattress that looked used but neatly placed. Right beside it sat a bucket and scattered food containers on the floor, stacked in a way that suggested someone had been trying to keep things organized, at least for a while. Standing in that doorway, I felt caught between curiosity and a kind of cautious unease I hadn't expected. The room didn't look abandoned in the usual sense. There were no cobwebs, no layers of thick dust, no sign that time had completely taken over. The mattress had a slight dip in the center, the kind that comes from someone lying in the same position night after night. The food containers were mostly instant noodles and canned beans, the kind you'd stash if you didn't expect to leave a room for a while. Emma ran her flashlight along the walls and found faint scratch marks near the floorboards, thin lines that trailed from one side of the room to the other, like someone had dragged something repeatedly. I stepped inside slowly, careful where I placed my feet, trying to absorb every detail without touching anything. The strangest part was how intentionally ordinary the room seemed, despite the situation. There was a single folding chair in the corner, angled toward the bed, and above it an outlet with an extension cord still plugged in, leading nowhere. The cord had been cut cleanly, leaving just frayed copper ends. The carpet had an odd rectangular imprint near the center, as if a piece of heavy furniture had once been there, but had been removed deliberately. Emma whispered my name, pointing to a small pile of notebooks stuffed beneath the bed. They weren't hidden well, more like someone had shoved them there in a hurry. I crouched down and pulled one out carefully. The cover was a dull blue, the kind you'd buy in bulk during school sales, but what caught my attention was the uneven pressure marks on the front, as if it had been gripped tightly. We opened the first notebook together, half expecting to find empty pages or something mundane. Instead, the entries were short, scattered messages written in different pen strokes, some shaky, others more controlled. Most entries didn't include dates, just fragmented sentences like, "Still here," "Quiet again," and "Can't hear him today." One page had a rough sketch of the room itself, drawn from the bed's perspective, showing the door with all the bolts illustrated in detail. Whoever wrote this had spent a lot of time staring at that door, memorizing every latch. As I flipped through more pages, Emma pointed out one section where the handwriting changed drastically. Longer entries, more frantic loops and underlines. One line repeated 3 times. "He checks at night." The way the ink bled a little made it seem like the writer pressed down too hard, like the message mattered more than the space left on the page. Emma wandered toward the corner opposite the bed and found something that made both of us step back instinctively. There were faint footprints on the carpet, just the outlines darker than the surrounding fibers. Not fresh, but not old enough to blend in. They faced the bed, perfectly aligned, spaced like someone had stood there for long periods without shifting. I felt this creeping awareness that the room wasn't just a leftover secret, it had been used with purpose. The deadbolts outside suddenly made more sense in the worst possible way. Someone had stayed here, someone had been kept here, and someone else had checked on them. The thought made my throat tighten, and I could tell Emma was trying hard not to imagine the stories behind those footprints. She whispered that we should call someone, but I wanted to search a little more before involving authorities, hoping for some logical explanation that wouldn't spiral into something darker. I moved toward a small built-in cabinet on the left side of the room, something we hadn't noticed at first because it blended too well with the paneling. The handle was worn unevenly, like someone with anxious hands had gripped it countless times. When I opened it, the stale smell intensified. Inside were 3 more notebooks, a stack of disposable utensils, and crumpled wrappers that had been flattened carefully, as if someone tried to keep them orderly. On the top shelf, hidden beneath a folded t-shirt, sat a cheap flip phone with its battery removed. Emma stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, asking why someone would keep a phone but remove the one thing that made it useful. The whole setup felt like a strange mix of isolation and preparation, as if the person trapped here believed they might get a chance to leave, but also understood that chance didn't come often. We didn't even notice how quiet the house had become until a thud echoed somewhere above us. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like a heel hitting old floorboards. Emma's eyes widened, reflecting the flashlight beam as she stared at the open doorway behind me. The sound didn't repeat, but the stillness afterward pressed down hard on both of us. I glanced toward the stairs leading up to the hall, trying to reassure myself that an old house settling could explain it, though the timing felt too precise. Emma reached for my sleeve and whispered that we should go back upstairs now. Before leaving, I snapped a photo of the room with my phone, not to analyze later, just so I had something to show if anyone questioned our story. As we stepped out, I made sure to keep the door wide open. For some reason, closing it felt wrong, almost disrespectful to whoever had been locked inside. When we got upstairs, the hallway lights we'd left on earlier were flickering. Not aggressively, just an uneven pulse that didn't match the rhythm of faulty wiring. Emma stayed close beside me while I checked each room, calling out just in case someone had wandered in without us hearing. Each space was empty, tools untouched, windows still latched. I could sense Emma's breathing quicken behind me, and the weight of everything we just discovered made the house feel smaller, like the walls were listening. We sat on the porch steps to get some air, trying to make sense of the day. After a few minutes, Emma insisted we call the police not to accuse anyone, but because the room felt like something far beyond a renovation issue. So we did. When the officers arrived, they were polite but notably serious after seeing the deadbolts and the notebooks. One of them told us quietly that the room resembled spaces used for long-term confinement, the kind designed to isolate someone without attracting attention. We didn't stay in the house after that. The officers asked us not to touch anything else until they finished their investigation, so we packed a few essentials and left to stay with Emma's cousin. A week later, they told us the room had likely been used within the last couple of years, maybe even more recently. They wouldn't share many details, only that they were still looking for the person responsible. We decided to walk away from the property entirely. The bank bought it back under some legal clause, and we never fought it. Even now, when I think about that room, the notebooks, the footprints, the heavy silence, I still wonder if the person who lived down there ever found a way out, or if the one checking on them still walks around free. I don't have answers, but leaving that house was the only choice that felt right. Moving into that basement apartment felt like the closest thing to independence I'd managed in years. I was juggling research work, late-night writing sessions, and a fellowship that barely covered anything, so finding a place that didn't look like it might collapse was already a win. The house had this old charm that was hard to describe: peeling white paint, narrow stairways, and a weird floral smell that seemed baked into the walls. My landlord, a tall guy named Harold, had walked me through the space quickly, rushing past one tiny door in the corner and muttering that it was for building maintenance only. I didn't give it much thought at the time. I just needed a quiet place where I could sleep without the sound of undergrads partying a floor above me. The first couple of days passed without anything unusual. The apartment wasn't big, just a narrow kitchen, a small sitting area, and a bedroom with a window barely the size of a shoebox. Every sound echoed strangely down there. Pipes hummed, the water heater clicked, and sometimes the old wooden beams let out these long sigh-like groans that made the whole place feel alive in a tired sort of way. That little door in the corner remained locked, a plain metal handle and a faded sticker warning that only authorized personnel were allowed. I never saw anyone come or go. There wasn't even dust disturbed around it, which somehow felt odd in a basement. About a week in, I remember sitting at my tiny desk revising a chapter draft when I heard something that didn't blend with the usual basement noises. It wasn't a pipe, and it wasn't the house shifting. It sounded like a short, dry cough, human, unmistakably human, coming from the other side of that locked utility room. At first, I literally laughed under my breath, thinking maybe I'd been awake too long. But then it came again, louder this time, like someone clearing their throat deliberately. I felt this quiet tension crawl through the room, the kind that makes you lift your head slowly because you're trying not to confirm what you think you heard. I walked toward the door, not even sure why, maybe out of instinct more than anything. The air around that corner felt heavier, like it hadn't been stirred in years, and the overhead light flickered a little as I approached. I pressed my ear close to the wood, half hoping I'd hear nothing so I could chalk it up to imagination. Instead, I caught a low, muffled mutter, like someone talking to themselves in a tired, breathless way. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but the rhythm was familiar. It was the sound of a person trying to steady their breathing. That's when a cold realization hit me. Whatever was behind that door wasn't mechanical, and definitely wasn't building maintenance. As soon as I stepped back from the door, I felt this strange mix of confusion and irritation building inside me. I wasn't scared yet, just unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone and went upstairs to talk to Harold, figuring maybe he had someone doing repairs or staying temporarily in that tiny room. When he opened his door, He had this impatient posture, like he'd been interrupted from something important. I told him exactly what I'd heard, keeping my voice calm, expecting a simple explanation. But his expression shifted fast, tightening in a way that made the whole interaction feel wrong. He told me I was mishearing the pipes and not to concern myself with things that didn't involve me. I tried pressing the issue gently, mentioning that it sounded unmistakably human. That's when his tone changed completely. He leaned in a little, his voice dropping to this sharp whisper that didn't match the friendly landlord impression he'd put on when I moved in. He said if I kept making trouble, there were plenty of people waiting for cheap rentals, and he wouldn't hesitate to terminate my lease. The phrasing hit me like a slap. Who talks like that over a noise complaint? I left his doorway feeling oddly defensive, not because of fear, but because I couldn't shake the sense that he was hiding something he didn't want anyone poking at. For the rest of that evening, I kept replaying the moment in my head while pretending to focus on my laptop. The basement felt different now, as if the silence itself had weight. Even regular noises, the hum of the fridge, the creak from upstairs, felt sharper, more deliberate. Every time I glanced toward that little locked door, I felt this nagging tension knotting in my chest. I kept telling myself I wouldn't go near it again. But when the house settled after midnight and that faint cough drifted out once more, just a single strained exhale, any resolve I had dissolving instantly. Instead of approaching the door this time, I turned off all the lights and sat quietly on my bed, listening. The sound came again, a short, dragging breath, followed by a rasp like someone trying to speak through dryness. It wasn't frantic or loud. It had this drained quality, as if whoever was in there had been in that state for a long time. That thought alone sent a current of unease through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wasn't supposed to be there, or worse, couldn't leave. I stayed awake for hours, waiting to hear movement or footsteps, but nothing else came. Just the memory of that sound looping in my mind, refusing to fade. By the next morning, my nerves were running on autopilot. Every small task, making coffee, packing my bag, locking the door behind me, felt mechanical, like my mind was somewhere else entirely. During the day on campus, I kept zoning out in the middle of conversations, picturing the layout of that utility room. It didn't make sense. The room couldn't have been larger than a walk-in closet, and there was no reason anyone should be inside it. By late afternoon, I'd convinced myself I needed to check it again, not to confront anything, but just to reassure myself that the noise had been some weird plumbing quirk. I returned home earlier than usual, hoping the quiet would make things clearer. The basement had that same cool stillness it always did, but standing at the bottom of the stairs, I swear the air carried a faint trace of something, like old laundry mixed with stale breath. I walked slowly toward the corner, feeling my pulse pound in a way I couldn't control. I leaned close to the door again and didn't hear anything at first, just silence. I must have stood there for a full minute before something brushed softly against the other side. A gentle shuffle, like fabric moving across concrete. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. That tiny sound felt like confirmation of every suspicion I'd been denying since the first night. I backed away and went straight upstairs to confront Harold again, not caring if he got irritated. When he opened the door, he had this rigid posture, as if he'd been expecting me. I told him plainly that someone was inside that utility room and that it wasn't safe or normal. His reaction was instant. His face flushed, and he stepped forward, blocking the doorway with this tense stillness that made my instincts light up in alarm. He repeated the same threat as before, telling me he wouldn't tolerate accusations and that tenants who couldn't respect boundaries didn't get to stay. There was something almost rehearsed about the way he said it. I didn't bother arguing. I turned around and left, but a new dread had settled in. If he was this protective of that door, then whatever was behind it wasn't just a problem. He was actively covering it up. That night, I made a decision. I packed my essentials, shoved everything into my car, and slept in the back seat outside a 24-hour diner. It wasn't comfortable, but at least I could rest without listening for coughs and whispers. The next morning, I returned only to give Harold my keys. I didn't explain anything, and he didn't ask. He just took them with this rigid expression that told me he was relieved to see me go. I moved into a new place within a week, and even now I sometimes think about that locked door. I've convinced myself someone was living in there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. I never found out who they were or why Harold hid them, but the sound of that weak, dragging breath still echoes in my memory whenever I walk past a closed door in an old building, and I've never rented a basement apartment again. Settling into that suburban place felt strangely quiet from the start, like the kind of silence you only notice after living in a busy apartment for years. I'd taken the house because I needed a reset, new job across town, long shifts, and a growing urge to finally have space that felt my own. The street had wide lawns, old maples leaning over the sidewalks, and neighbors who waved from their driveways but didn't push conversation. That first week, I spent most mornings sipping coffee by the kitchen window, trying to fall into a routine that made sense. It was during one of those early hours, when the sky looked washed out and pale, that I noticed someone standing near the back fence. At first, my mind tried to label her as a neighbor walking a dog or checking a garden bed, but she wasn't doing anything, just standing there, still as a post, looking straight at the window where I stood. Her appearance didn't match what my brain expected from that distance. Shoulder-length dark hair with a messy streak of gray, a heavy knit sweater even though the air wasn't cold, and a posture that gave no hint of hesitation. She looked middle-aged, maybe early 50s, and held her hands close to her sides like she didn't trust them not to shake. What unsettled me most was the intensity of the stare, steady, unblinking, like she was trying to see past the glass and into the room. I remember stepping back, unsure of whether I should wave, shout, or just pretend I hadn't noticed. After a few seconds, she turned and walked off, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward the path behind the yard. No rush, no guilt, just quiet retreat. I waited another minute before even breathing normally again. The next morning, she came back. Same spot near the fence, same stillness, same unwavering attention toward the kitchen window. That time I made myself act. I went outside, expecting her to step away or pretend she was lost. Instead, she faced me calmly, almost politely. She introduced herself as Marla and spoke in this oddly gentle tone, the kind you'd hear from someone offering condolences rather than explaining why they're trespassing. She said she used to live in my house and was just checking on things, as if that were completely normal. When I asked her to leave, she apologized so sincerely that it made me uncomfortable, like I'd interrupted something meaningful to her. She walked off again, quiet and slow, leaving me standing there with questions that felt too strange to ask out loud. By the third morning, her return didn't surprise me as much as it frustrated me. A neighbor seeing this would think I'd invited her or was somehow involved in whatever routine she had built around my backyard. I tried being more firm, told her she couldn't keep coming, couldn't treat the place like it was still hers. She nodded, but the expression on her face didn't match someone learning a boundary. It looked more like someone hearing bad news but accepting it anyway. Later that day, while rearranging boxes in the garage, I found a small, scratched-up house key hidden behind a loose panel near the storage shelf. It wasn't mine. The metal looked worn from years of use, and the keychain attached, a faded leather tag, suggested it had been kept close by someone for a long time. The thought hit me immediately, landing so abruptly I had to sit down. Marla hadn't just been visiting the yard. That key bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I kept turning it in my hand, checking the teeth and comparing it to the spare keys the realtor left for me, and it wasn't even close to any of them. It felt like a relic from a version of the house I didn't know, something belonging to her life here, her routines, her habits, her secrets. I tried to reassure myself by thinking she might have forgotten to return it during the sale, but the way it had been hidden didn't line up with that. People don't tuck things behind panels unless they're trying to keep them accessible without being seen. The thought of her moving around the garage before I lived there, stashing keys and who knows what else, kept replaying in my head. I couldn't shake the suspicion that she wasn't just reminiscing but inspecting. That night, I installed a couple of cheap cameras I'd bought but never bothered to set up. One inside the hallway, one facing the kitchen, and another in the backyard near the patio light. It felt silly at first, like I was overreacting to a harmless, confused woman. But something in me needed evidence, needed to know if she was coming back when I wasn't awake to see her. I went to bed later than usual, drifting in and out of sleep, expecting the alert on my phone to ping at any second. No sound came. By sunrise, I convinced myself the cameras had been unnecessary. The whole situation just an odd interaction blown out of proportion in my head. The morning light looked softer than usual, almost reassuring, until I glanced out the window and saw the empty patch of grass where she usually stood. The absence didn't comfort me. It made my chest tighten in a way that suggested I was missing a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized existed. Later that afternoon, curiosity won out over my nerves, and I decided to review the footage. At first, everything looked normal. Me making dinner, walking around with my phone, turning off lights. Then around 2 in the morning, the hallway camera flickered for half a second. Nothing dramatic, just enough to catch my attention. When the image steadied, there she was, walking calmly through the living room like she'd memorized every inch of the floor. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. She moved with the kind of familiarity you only see from someone navigating their own home in the dark. She stepped into my bedroom, the camera catching the outline of her sweater and the subtle dip of her head as she stood at the end of the bed, not moving, not speaking, just standing there, watching me sleep for what the timestamp claimed was nearly 2 hours. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I finally paused the footage. My room looked so normal in the clip. Folded clothes on the chair, half-open blinds, the faint glow of the street lamp outside. And that contrast made the scene feel even more disturbing. She left right before the sun began to lighten the edges of the curtains, slipping through the hallway and letting herself out the back door without making a sound. The knowledge that she'd walked right past me, right through the heart of the house without waking me up, felt like a violation far deeper than anything I'd imagined. Even though it was midday when I watched the footage, the house felt smaller, like the walls were listening. I kept replaying one detail, the way she glanced around the room before leaving, not like someone sneaking out, but like someone making sure everything stayed exactly how she remembered. Calling the police felt like the only reasonable move, even though part of me worried they'd dismiss the whole situation as a misunderstanding with a harmless former homeowner. When the officers arrived, they didn't raise their eyebrows or suggest I was imagining things. They took one look at the footage, and their expressions tightened in a way that told me this wasn't the first unsettling call they'd handled involving someone fixated on a past residence. They asked for the key I'd found, bagged it, and started checking the entry points around the house. One of them pointed out faint scratches near the back door's lock, marks I hadn't noticed because they blended with the old paint. They said they needed to bring her in for questioning, and for the first time since meeting her, I realized I wasn't dealing with someone lost in nostalgia, but someone who had never fully accepted that the house wasn't hers anymore. A detective followed up later that evening, asking for any details I could remember about her appearance, voice, or behavior. I didn't hold much back. Everything still sat fresh in my mind, sharpened by how close she had come to me while I slept. He explained that they had looked her up and found something unexpected. She had legally sold the house 3 years earlier, but never updated her address, never changed the pattern of visiting, and had maintained access to several other properties she'd previously owned. 14 to be exact. The detective said she wasn't violent, at least not historically, but her attachment to old homes had escalated in the past year. Hearing him describe her behavior clinically made the whole situation feel even stranger, like I had stumbled into a story no one would believe without proof. They found her later that night sitting on the curb a few blocks away, holding a small ring of keys and talking calmly to herself. She didn't resist, didn't argue. She just said she needed to make sure things were still where they belonged. When they searched her belongings, they found keys to houses scattered across different neighborhoods, labeled with little handwritten notes about the families currently living in them. The idea that she'd been moving quietly through people's lives, checking furniture arrangements or standing in bedrooms like some guardian stuck in the wrong reality, unsettled everyone involved. The officers told me they'd restrict her access and set up a court order to keep her away from my property, promising to patrol the area more frequently for a while. Life eventually settled back into something close to normal. The mornings felt lighter without the dread of seeing her figure at the fence, and sleeping became easier once the locks were changed and the cameras stayed blessedly unremarkable. But there are moments, usually when the house is too quiet or the air feels stale, when I remember the way she stood in the yard those first mornings, focused on the window as if expecting someone else to appear behind the glass. I keep all the lights on in the hallway now, not because I'm scared she'll come back, but because I can't unsee the version of my home that existed in her mind. She might never understand that she no longer lives here, but I've had to accept a different truth. No matter how much you think you know a place, there can always be someone who knows it better, someone who never really left.